Shalom Aleichem. Welcome to all. And Hanukkah Sameach, or as some people might claim, Hanukkah Samecha. But let us refer perhaps to Yemei Hanukkah Samechim. That makes the most sense um, in terms of Hebrew grammar. Today is the third day of Hanukkah. That is to say, Yom Revi'i B'Shabbat, Wednesday, Kav Zayin B'Chislev Tavshin Pei-Wav, according to our Jewish calendar, corresponding to the 17th of December 2025, according to the Gregorian calendar. And with me today, once again, is one of my favorite interlocutors, Rabbi Michael Friedman, who is also a therapist and what have you, something in that field of mental health. And today being Hanukkah, we thought perhaps we would discuss some things that pertain to Hanukkah. And I will begin by sharing a screen with you and with our viewers. And you should be able to see now Hilchot Hanukkah Perek Gimel. So this is from the Mishneh Torah by Rabbeinu Agadol Rambam, by Maimonides. And Rambam describes the events of that time as follows. It's important to read this and to take note. Rambam says, Bevayt Sheni, in the Second Temple period, Kashem Alechuya one that at the time, this period in history when the Greeks ruled over Eretz Yisrael, we're talking about 170 odd years or something like that, shall we say, after the death of Alexander the Great. Gazeru Gezerot al Yisrael. We know that these Gezerot, these policies, government policies, were introduced by the Greco-Syrian government, which was centered in what is today referred to as Syria, which Bezrat Hashem will not exist for much longer, but who knows exactly how things will play out and when these things will happen. But I don't think Syria has. I would not take out a life insurance policy on the state of Syria. Gazeru Gezerot al Israel. The Greco-Syrians decided to essentially to eradicate Judaism, and in other words, to eradicate the Jewish people also. In other words, to turn them into Hellenists. And this is a very important point. This is not mentioned here in the Rambam. It's not at all clear to what extent Rambam was actually familiar with all the historical details, because he didn't have historical texts before him that could have taught him from which he could have learned many things regarding that time, which we have today. We have the book of the Hashmonaim, Sefer Hashmonaim, Aleph and Beth, particularly Aleph, the first one, and which was not included in the Tanakh, in the Bible, and the Jewish people lost all connection with it for a very long period of time, unfortunately. And we also have the writings of Yosefus Flavius, Yosef ben Matityahu. And whatever one chooses to think or feel about him, he was a rather good historian. And he was not very far removed from the events. It's true, he wasn't alive at this time, but he was fairly close to the events. And we learn from what he writes many important things. So at this time, we're talking about 167, 165 BCE, before the Gregorian calendar begins, the Minyanam. The aim was to destroy and undermine Judaism, outlaw Judaism, prevent Jews continuing the Jewish traditions, study of Torah, circumcision, etc., as we know. from various sources. That's what Rambam sums up in a few words. They do not allow these this persecution was aimed at preventing the Jewish people from studying Torah and performing the mitzvot and living according to Jewish standards and notions and practices. And these Greco-Syrians stole, embezzled, and taxed the Jews to death, and thus stole their money, their financial resources, and their women. They found various ways, shall we say, of having their way with Jewish women and kidnapping them, enslaving them, and what have you. On top of this, these Greco-Syrians, and as I will mention, and their supporters, and this is very important, their Jewish supporters, that's what I mean to say, they entered the Mikdash, they destroyed part of the walls around the Mikdash. They attacked the Mikdash in various ways. And they defiled all the various um, supplies that were in the Mikdash, including, for example, oil, which was used for the menorah, for example. And the Jewish people suffered very greatly at their hands. And they were terribly persecuted and in very dire straits. Until Hashem took pity and had mercy over until the God of their fathers, of our ancestors' fathers, took pity on them, and saved them from the hands of these evildoers. And those known as Bnei Hashmonai, that is to say, the Jewish rebels who rose up, led by Matityahu, who was called Hashmonai, he and his sons. He had 5 sons. They were based in Modi'in, roughly halfway between Yerushalayim and Tel Aviv at the present time. They organized, they were the instigators of what became a widespread rebellion against the Greco-Syrian regime. So these Jews and their followers rose up. They were Kohanim Gedolim. Technically, this is not accurate because at this time these Kohanim, were not Kohanim Gedolim. They became subsequently Kohanim Gedolim. That is to say, the high priests. But at this point, they were not. We have to keep in mind, of course, that the high priest, the official high priest, the Kohen Gadol at this time, was a supporter and an instigator of these government persecutions and policies. So these people had to be replaced, and they were replaced by these Bnei Hashmonai, who were themselves Kohanim. And they killed these evildoers. Rambam says explicitly that they killed. Doesn't say exactly whom they killed, but they killed many people, as we shall see. It's more explicit in Sefer Hashmonaim, also known as Sefer Maccabim, also in Yosef Matityahu, Josephus Flavius. So Rambam mentions explicitly, without going into great detail, and again, Rambam didn't have all the details. Even if he had seen the writings of Yosef Matityahu, which were written in Greek, and there's no reason whatever to believe that for one moment that he saw these writings of Yosef Matityahu, of Josephus, Rambam did not understand Greek. We know this for various reasons. Rambam was familiar with Greek thought and writing, but that was because it was all translated into Arabic, and he read it in the Arabic. Greek he did not know. The works of Yosef Matzityahu were not translated into Arabic, and they were not current and readily available amongst the Jews. They were essentially only survived because the some of the Christian churches saw value and importance in these books and kept them and protected them for from that time to this. So we owe them that much. So these Jews rose up and fought against these enemies and killed many of them and saved the Jewish people from their hands. And they appointed a king from amongst these Kohanim, which is again, all this is very much contracted. This is not, it didn't all happen in 5 minutes as it sounds from here. We're talking about a period of decades, of 30 plus years. وَهَيَمِيدُ مَلَخْ مِنَ الكُّهَانِيمِ وَحَزَّرَ مَلْخُوتِ يِسْرَائِيل يَثَّرَ عَلْ 200 سَنَةً. So an independent Jewish state was established. Malchut means a state. وَحَزْرَ مَلْخُوتِ Israel. The Jewish people became sovereign once again for the first time since the end of Beit Rishon. So we're talking about a period of over 400 years, well over 400 years. وحزراء ملخوت إسرائيل يثير على 200 سنة. Rambam says that from this time, and it's true, from this time until the destruction of the Second Temple is roughly 200 years. But the fact is that there was no Jewish independence, no sovereign Jewish state for 200 years. That did not exist. It existed for less than 100 years. Maybe 100 years, you could say at the most, but not more than that. Rambam here is quoting from a text that is known as Mechilat Antiochus, which is an ahistoric and somewhat fanciful text, very brief, written in Aramaic, which the Temanim used to, and some of them perhaps still do, read on Shabbat, on Hanukkah, which describes these events very, very briefly and in a very imprecise ahistorical manner. But there it says exactly these words, that Malchut Yisrael returned for 200 years. So Rambam saw that, and he quotes it from there, Ada Hurban Sheni, until the destruction of the second Mikdash. So Rambam, without being an historian and without having seen the historical sources, nevertheless, if you read the historical sources, you discover that Rambam's presentation and description of the events is actually very, very accurate and close to the truth in most respects. As I've pointed out, there are a few details that are not precise, but that doesn't change the essence of the story. So to this point, what did Rambam discuss? Rambam discussed persecution, which was based on religious persecution of the Jewish religion, of the Jewish people and their beliefs and their way of life, which was all motivated by, some would say religious, I would say more cultural factors and aims. The aim was to Hellenize the Jewish people, which of course involves undermining and eradicating the Jewish religion, because that is the essence and the central pillar of Jewish civilization and culture. So these things obviously go together. In the first halakha that we just read, therefore, Rambam describes the Jewish people living in their land, and this is, of course, only part of the Jewish people living in Eretz Israel at this time. Much of the Jewish people resided in Bavel, in Babylon, in Paras, in Persia, and other countries in the further to the east and to the north. Rambam describes here general persecution and also foreign occupation. He refers to Malchu Yawan, in other words, foreigners ruled in our land, and they instituted these made these laws and persecuted the Jewish people and did not want them to continue to be Jews. That was the point. And there was a rebellion. Rambam doesn't go into the details, which he did not know really, but he he hints at a rebellion because these Bnei Hashmonai came from somewhere, and they killed people. It says v'haragum v'hoshiu Israel miyadam, and they saved the Jewish people from their persecutors. And Jewish independence was restored for the first time, as I mentioned, in over 400 years, and lasted, shall we say, for 100 years. Rambam says 200, whatever. Jewish sovereign existence in Eretz Israel, Jewish independent sovereign Jewish state, was reestablished. This was a tremendous uh, watershed event in Jewish history. Jewish people had not lived in their own land under their own sovereign government for many, many centuries, as we mentioned. Now in Halakha Bet, Rambam goes on to say, and when the Jewish people overcame their enemies and ibadum, which means destroyed them, which is exactly what Rambam said 2 lines before, and they killed them. In other words, Rambam is again in very few words describing a situation of open war, rebellion, bloodshed, revolt, which led to this new situation. When what this actually refers to is the time, is the date when they were able to return, or close to the date they were able to return to Yerushalayim, because for a number of years prior to this event, to this rebellion which succeeded, the Jews had been banned from entering Yerushalayim, anywhere, all the environs of Yerushalayim, and the Mikdash had been turned into a place of Avodah Zarah. The Kohen Gadol, the high priest, was in favor of sacrificing pigs to Zeus, etc. So obviously that, for instance, that Mikdash, I'm sorry, that Mizbeach, that altar, had to be dismantled and removed. The stones, all that was defiled. It can no longer be used for Avodat HaMikdash, for Avodat HaKodesh. It cannot be used for the proper Torah Torah-based avodah of the Mikdash, the sacrificial service in the Mikdash. So there was a period of time when they had to renovate the Mikdash altogether. So they entered the Mikdash, and they found only one. Now this is for the purpose of lighting the menorah, and we'll discuss why immediately we discuss the menorah and the oil that is required for the menorah, for the candelabra. They found only one small jug or jar of oil, which was tahor, because the chatqila, normally the only oil that is tahor, that is ritually pure, may be used for the menorah, as is true for all aspects, all the vessels and all the various materials used in the Avodat HaMikdash, in the temple. This is an interesting point also, because if there is no shemen tahor, then the halacha is that you may use shemen tameh, which already brings this whole, what we're about to read now, it brings this into question. What is this all about? Because if had they not found any oil, what could they have done? They should have gone ahead and lit the mikdash, the menorah, I'm sorry, with that oil, whatever oil was available. That is the halacha. Shetuma dehuya b'tzibur. At any rate, it's another discussion. It was only enough oil for one day. And there was a miracle because what should have lasted one day lasted 8 days. Until they were able to obtain olives and uh, press them for oil and produce shemen tahor. All right, so in Halacha Gimel, ומפני זה התקינו חכמים שבאותו הדור, the Chachamim, the sages of Am Yisrael at that time instituted because of all of these events, שיהיו שמונת הימים האלו שתחילתן מלילי 25 בכסלו, ימי שמחה והלל. They instituted and decreed that these 8 days, starting on the 25th of Kislev, should be 8 days of celebration. It says here, Yemei Simcha v'Halel. These words, Yemei Simcha, are understood by some poskim to imply that there is an inyan to have seudot, to have get-togethers, parties, meals, etc. But it's not. Chazal do not state this explicitly, but these words of Rambam imply this. Yemei Simcha v'Halel, and also Halel is recited for all 8 days. There are only 2 occasions during the year when Halel is recited for 8 days straight, and that is Hanukkah and Sukkot and Shmini Aseret. Umadlikim b'hem haneroth ba'erev, and another thing that was instituted by the Chachamim at that time was that we light candles in the evening. Al pithei batim, at the entrance to our homes, b'chol laila v'laila, on each of these nights, mishmonat haleloth. V'yamim elu hem hanikraim Hanukkah, and these days are known as Hanukkah. And these days are asurim b'sefer v'ta'anith, as we don't say nefilat hapayim, tahanun. It's a sort to fast on these days. Kimei hapurim, v'hadlakat haneroth bahen miswa midivrei sofarim kikriyat hamechila. And the lighting of these candles is a miswa midivrei sofarim, comparable to the miswa to read the Megillah on Purim. Rambam, in the first 2 prakim, the first 2 chapters of this section, spoke about Megillah and Purim, and here he's talking about Hanukkah. So he's saying what you just learned before in the previous chapter or 2, referring to Megillah and Purim. Here we have something similar with regards to Hanukkah. That is what Rambam has to say on the subject. And now I wish to compare what we just saw now, what we just read in the Rambam, to what the Tur, Rabbeinu Yaakov ben Harosh, the author of the famous halachic text, the Tur, what he writes about this topic. And here I will also share with you. You should be able to see now, I think. This is the Tur Bar-Hayim, Siman Tov Resh Ayin. This is a direct quote actually from the Talmud Bavli. This is what the Torah says. My Hanukkah. What is Hanukkah? Lichora, the question is, what is the Hanukkah all about? Although that's not clear either, because you could understand, as the Maharsha understands, the question to be, why do we light candles on Hanukkah? Not what is Hanukkah all about, but rather, why do we light candles on Hanukkah? For example, we do not light candles on Purim. We do not light candles on Pesach to celebrate or commemorate anything. So what is this business of lighting candles on Hanukkah? So the Talmud Bavli states, and this is what the Torah quotes, Netanya was taught as follows: B'chafhe b'chislev yemei Hanukkah temanaya inun dalal mispad behon udalal migzor behon ta'anith. These are 8 days of celebration where mourning and fasting are not allowed, starting on the 25th of Kislev. This is a quote from Megillat Ta'anit, an ancient text going back to the time of towards the end of Beit Sheni, which was actually compiled over many generations, commemorating various days when the Jewish people were victorious over their enemies, or something very positive happened for the Jewish people. That's what Megillat Ta'anit is all about. And it's written in Aramaic. And that's why the quote we just read is in Aramaic. And now the Talmud and the Torah, quoting the Talmud, goes on to say, "Keshenichnesu goyim b'eichal, timuu kol hashemanim sheb'eichal." The Gentiles, the Greco-Syrians, defiled everything they found at the Mikdash, including all the oil. وخشجavra yad malchut bet hashmonai. ونصحهم, and when the Hashmonaim and when the Jews rose up under the leadership of the Hashmonaim rose up, those who eventually established a new government and a new regime which replaced the old regime, uh, headed by the Hashmonaim. When they rose up and were victorious, ونصحهم وذكوا ولو مسوا على فخ حوض الشمن, they searched for oil and they found only one small container, Shaya Hathum Moshe Kohen Gadol, that was sealed with the seal of the Kohen Gadol. ולא היה בו אלא כדי להדליק יום אחד, ונעשה בו נס והדליקו בו שמונה ימים. And that which should have lasted one day lasted for 8 days. לשנה אחרת, and therefore the following year, קבעו ימים טובים בהלל והודאה. They established these 8 days of Hanukkah to be days of reciting Hallel and thanking Hashem by saying Al Hanisim in Birkat HaMazon, in Tefillah. As he points out, Perush Lomar Bahem Hallel Ulehodot Lomar Bo Al Hanisim Uvehodah. Now, compare this description of the Torah, which is based on an explicit statement of a few lines in the Talmud Bavli, to what Rambam described. What do you see? What difference do you how would you characterize these two descriptions?
Well, the tour, I've never noticed this before. The tour totally omits the extensive oppression in all aspects of Jewish life, threats to bodies, threats to the very fabric of Torah and religious life. The extensive description that the Rambam presents here is all just encapsulated in a few short words of the tour that they came and defiled the temple.
Exactly. The Torah, although we have to be clear and precise, the Torah is quoting the statement in the Talmud Bavli, Masechet Shabbat, Daf Kaf Aleph. That's what he's doing. And that statement there, which he quotes here, refers to one thing only, and that is Nes Pach Hashemen. In other words, if you, and especially if you don't go into it in great depth, you don't think about it too much, you could easily be forgiven for thinking that Hanukkah is all about one thing only, Nes Pach Hashemen. There was a quantity of oil that miraculously, supernaturally lasted longer than was expected, and that naturally, normally would be the case. And that is why we have a festival called Hanukkah. Correct? And that is exactly what most Jews, for many, many generations, shall we say, in the wake of the Talmud Bavli's presentation of these events, that is exactly how most Jews understood it. And what we are here discussing today, and what we will try and explain and demonstrate, is that this is a complete misapprehension and misunderstanding and misrepresentation of the historical events and of the Torah and halachic and ideological content of Hanukkah. So let us again mention Rambam. Rambam gives a much more thorough and historically accurate and comprehensive explanation and description of what happened, correct? He mentions the fact that there were these Greco-Syrians who were ruling over the Jewish people, and they instituted various laws and measures in order to Rambam says uvitalu datha. Their aim was to eradicate Judaism and thus force the Jewish people to become Hellenized. That is to say, like many other nations and groups, ethnic groups that existed within this Greco-Syrian this kingdom of the Greco-Syrians. And Rambam mentions persecutions involving their money, bimamonam and uvivnothehem, and their womenfolk. And then it goes on to discuss how they entered the Mikdash and caused havoc in the Mikdash and the temple. And then it goes on to mention that Hashem took pity on the Jewish people. And in what in which way do we see this the fact that Hashem, how is it manifested in reality that Hashem took pity on the Jewish people, that these Jews rose up, as is not, it's not described here, but we know that we have the descriptions in Sefer Hashmonaim Aleph, in the first book of the Maccabees, and in Josephus. A revolt was initiated by the Hashmonaim, by this family, and by one man, specifically by the name of Matithyahu, who was a Kohen, who was the head of a clan of Kohanim living in the city of Modi'in. The story told in briefly in the historical sources is that there was a policy and a decree that in every town, every Jewish village and settlement, the Jews were forced to offer a sacrifice to a Greek god, probably Zeus, usually the head of their pantheon of gods, and they would always turn to the most important person, the head honcho, so to speak, in the town, to do this, to show that, if you do it, then everyone will follow suit and everyone will learn from your example. And Matithyahu was chosen by these Greco-Syrians to do this thing, and he refused, which is, of course, that in itself is a great act of bravery, very courageous thing to do, because obviously he was risking his life. As it is described there in those sources, they turned to another Jew who was inclined to go along with their policies and their wishes. And Matithyahu had apparently planned for such an event. And when this Jew approached the altar, the Mizbeach, to perform this sacrifice, this act of Avodah Zarah, which is also therefore in a public and demonstrative way, in order to show that we must accept, and we do accept, the dictates of these idol worshipping Greco-Syrians and their supporters, that we reject Judaism and we take upon ourselves their culture and their civilization and their religion. So this Jew was willing to do so, and as he approached the Mizbeach, the altar, Matithyahu rose up and killed him. He had prepared, obviously was hiding a knife or something like that, because that's what it says in the text in the book of Maccabees and in Josephus. He rose up and he killed him, and he announced, whoever is for Hashem, follow me, and that was the beginning of the revolt. This is not mentioned here in the Rambam explicitly in detail, and it's not mentioned in any Chazalic work, but those are the historical details with which we are familiar from those sources. Rambam goes into all of this. And then he also mentions Nespach Hashemen. That's entirely true. He does not gloss over that which the Talmud Bavli discusses regarding Nespach Hashemen, but he does mention it, but it's only part of the picture. And what I want to show you now is what we find in that work that I referred to earlier as Megillat Ta'anith, which we have to understand. Megillat Ta'anith is divided into two parts. That the original layer of the text, which is in Aramaic, which is very brief, just those words that we read before from the Talmud, which we'll read again now, and then all kinds of additions that were added in order to explain that which is said in the main part of the text. Okay, so this is what it says in Megillat Ta'anith, and I will share this with you. It says in Megillat Ta'anith, the Mishnah, the main part of the text, the original text says, "Esrim Hamisha beChislev," the 25th of Kislev. What is special about this day? "Be'esrim Hamisha beHanukkah timenaya yomin delala mispat bahon." That's exactly what the Talmud Bavli quoted. There are 8 days beginning on the 25th of Kislev, which are days of celebration, and therefore you do not fast on these days, and you do not mourn, and you do not say tahanun, nefilat hapayim, and various other things are not done on these days. Okay? Now we have one, two, three, four, five, six, seven different statements which then appear in our text of the Megillat Ta'anith to explain what that which happened at that time. Let us go through them quickly. The first is the statement in the Masechet Shabbat Daf Kaf Aleph, which we discussed already, which was quoted by the Torah. We won't read that again. In other words, there the focus is entirely on the Nes Pach Hashem and the oil. Correct? Number two, Beth, here, what you see here, Beth. Umar ra'u la'asot Hanukkah shemona yamim. Here, the question being asked is, why did they institute 8 days? Why specifically 8 days? The question here is that when we find in other places in the Tanakh that when a mikdash and a mizbeach, an altar and a temple are dedicated, there is a 7 day period of commemoration of celebration, etc., and inauguration. And here we have 8 days. That's the question. Why 8 days? So it says, "V'halo Hanukkah she'asa Moshe b'midbar lo asa ela shivat yamim." In the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, when they built the Mishkan, it was not 8 days; it was 7 days. This is explicitly in the Torah. וכן עשינו בחנוכה שעשה שלמה, שלא עשה אלא 7 ימים, שנאמר כי חנוכת המזבח עשו 7 ימים. והיה חג 7 ימים. It says explicitly in דברי ימים. The Hanukkah of the Mizbeach, which is what we're talking about also. The word Hanukkah today refers to the Hanukkat HaMizbeach, the inauguration of the new Mizbeach, of the new altar, which they had to renovate and replace the old one with a new one because it had been defiled by Avodah Zarah. It was done, this celebration was for 7 days, not for 8 days. So why was it here 8 days? That's the question. In other words, there's no question why they had something called Hanukkah. Obviously, you have to commemorate these days when the Mikdash is reactivated. The Mikdash had been essentially desolate and fallen into disuse for a number of years prior to this time. Apparently 3 years or something like that. So this was a new beginning for the Mikdash, and this was a new Mizbeach, a new altar. מה ראו לעשות חנוכה זו 8 ימים? Why 8 days? אלא בימי מלכות יהוה נכנסו בית בני חשמל להיכל ובנו את המזבח וסדוהו בסיד ותקנו בו כלי שרת והיו מתעסקים בו 8 ימים. No mention of any oil. All it says is that the process, the project of renovating and replacing the old Mizbeach with a new one and doing the various things that needed to be done in the Mikdash in order to reactivate the Mikdash. So in order to be able to have a Hanukkah Mizbeach, that was a process, and that was a project that took 8 days. So it took them 8 days to do this. It says. So we also celebrate for 8 days to commemorate the rededication of the Mikdash, which was an 8 day project. Okay, but no mention of oil. Note. Gimel. Next thing mentioned there. Hanukkah b'nei Hashmonai Dorot. Why do we celebrate what happened at the time of the Hashmonaim for all time? For example, what's the question here? The question here is as follows. Do we celebrate every year on some particular day or 7 days or 8 days of the year the Hanukkah of the Mishkan in the time of Moshe Rabbeinu?
No.
We don't.
Even though am I correct that technically was ready on Chafei Kislev, it just waited until Nisan?
Well, that's another discussion. We won't go into that particular detail, but the fact is we do not commemorate the Hanukkah, the beginning of the use and the dedication and inauguration of the Mishkan, the time of Moshe Rabbeinu. We do not celebrate this every year, correct? The same is true for the Hanukkah HaMizbech in the time of Shlomo, the time of the first Mikdash, when the first Mikdash was built and dedicated by Shlomo HaMelech, King Solomon. We don't commemorate this every year. And why, therefore, do we commemorate that which was done by the Hashmonaim every year? Since from that time to this, we're talking about uh, over 2,200 years. So what does the this statement here say? ولما هي نحيلت للضرورة إلا شعصاه بثيثم مثرا لروحها وأمروا بهلال وهذا. In other words, because this event, this particular Hanukkah of the Mizbeach, this particular uh, beginning of the Mikdash, this was like essentially a new beginning for the second Mikdash, which existed but had fallen to disuse and had been perverted and contaminated. This event was not just uh, a religious event; it was also part of a great upheaval and salvation of the Jewish people from their enemies. It says, the reason we say Hallel is because of the, as we'll discuss further, is because of the salvation, the military victories, and the tremendous ch turn for the better in the circumstances of the Jewish people at that time. So the 8 days are celebrated here not because of the Mizbeach so much, but because of the general overall historical event that we are celebrating. That's what this statement here, Gimel, in the Book of Tanith is saying. And now we have a Dalet. It says, "Uma ra'ula liket hanerot." Okay, you've explained all sorts of things, but why do we light candles? You can celebrate it in various ways. Why light candles specifically? Here it says, "Lefi shenichnasu Yevanim b'hechal." When the goyim invaded the Mikdash and defiled it, כשגברה yad beth Hashmonai lo haya bemed la'atik. They did not. We were unable to light. Why were they unable to light? Because of oil? No. שנכנסו בני חשמונאי להיכל, they had no menorah. Why did they not have a menorah? Simple. Menorah was stolen. Menorah is a large object made of pure beaten gold. It's worth a lot of money. It was stolen. It was not there. When they returned, they were able to overcome their enemies and return the Jewish people, that is to say, the Hashmonaim, the heads of the rebellion and their followers, their soldiers, when they were able to return to Yerushalayim and re-enter the Mikdash after a number of years that Jews had not been able to be in Yerushalayim or in the Mikdash. They found there was no menorah. Shenichnesu b'nei Hashmon leichal, lo haya b'mei la'adlik. There was nothing to light with. There wasn't a problem with oil. There was a problem. The problem was no menorah. What did they do? Heviu shiv'a shipudei barzel. So they created a menorah from much more simple and modest materials. That is to say, shipudei. They took pieces of iron, pig iron, if you'll excuse the expression, simple iron, shipudei barzel, wahipum b'va'ath, and they um, plated it. They plated these sticks and these pieces, these rods of iron. They plated them with some more congenial looking material, not simple. Didn't leave it as simple iron. وَهِذْلِكُوا بَهِمَةَ هَنِرَوْتَ and they lit using that. That was the menorah that they used. And by the way, this is a halacha ma'aseh, which appears in Mishneh Torah of Rambam, based on what it says explicitly in the Talmud, based on this statement, that if the Jewish people find themselves in any particular time when they have a mikdash and they need a menorah, but they don't have one made of gold, as described in the Torah, that's lechatchila. But the avad, you make a menorah from whatever you have, and you go ahead and light the menorah. That's the halacha ma'aseh, which we learned from what they did at that time. Again, you see no mention of anything to do with oil, but you do see mention of the fact that they found themselves without all the kelim, without all the vessels that they needed to conduct the avodah in the mikdash. Another thing that should be pointed out is that we should ask ourselves why of all the various avudot, the various mitzvot which we are to perform in the Mikdash, why do we see again, time and again, that they are referring to these sources are referring to one particular mitzvah, the Hadlakat HaNeroth, the lighting of the menorah. Why not the various sacrifices, Mizbeach, the altar, etc., animal sacrifices? Why not? Because that took longer. You had to first dismantle the old Mizbeach, which is a large edifice made of stone, and you have to dismantle that and remove all those stones, which were then had to be also put away in a special place because they once were used for the Mizbeach, which therefore they're Kodesh, they're holy, they're sanctified, but now they cannot be used because they're also defiled. So you don't just throw them away. They had to be placed in a special place. They were locked up. They were genazum. They were placed into geniza. And to rebuild that mizbeach, that altar, etc., took at least several days, apparently longer. From what we saw before, the whole process was 8 days. So, but in order to light some simple candles made of with oil in a makeshift menorah, as we just read, that doesn't take very long. That can be done in maybe in half a day. So the very first mitzvah they were able to perform when they entered the Mikdash was the mitzvah of Hadlakat menorah, and that's why the menorah became a symbol for all these events to do with Hanukkah, and that's what we see. We'll see in a moment. In Hay it says here the question that's being addressed is why do we say hello for 8 days? As we pointed out, this is unusual. وما رأوا לגמור בהם את ההלל, ללמדך או ללמדך שכל תשועה ותשועה שעשה הקודש ברוך הוא לישראל הם מקדימים לפניו בהלל ובשבח. Whenever the Jewish people find themselves in times of trouble and tribulation, and Hashem saves us from our enemies, we are required to thank Hashem. That is an essential fundamental concept in Judaism. We do not allow things simply to go by the by. And okay, Baruch Hashem worked out. Baruch Hashem, let's get on with life. Let's get on with whatever we have to do, and let's not discuss it any further. That's exactly what happened with Hizkiyahu when the Jewish people were saved from Sanheriv, when the Ashurim, the Assyrians, tried to conquer Yerushalayim, and they were saved by way of a plague which struck the Assyrian army. And Chazal say that Hizkiah did not recite Shira, was not sufficiently motivated, or he omitted to institute thanking Hashem for this event. So that's what it says here. It says, this is what it says in the Sefer Ezra. ויענו בהלל ובהודות לאדוני כי טוב כי לעולם חסדו על ישראל וכל העם הריעו תרועה גדולה בהלל אדוני על הוסד בית אדוני. So we see the idea of when Hashem saves us and also enables us to rededicate the Mikdash, obviously we have to thank Hashem, as this pasuk in Ezra, Perek Gimel, suggests that when Hashem does such things for you, and we see everything as being connected to Hashem, not things that happen by themselves, then we must thank Hashem. And if we do not do so, then we are acting most inappropriately. And so it goes on to say, Hashem brings about the salvation. And what must we do, as Rashi points out in that pasuk? And we must thank Hashem for that salvation. So Hashem brings the Yeshua, and our job is that doesn't mean that we have no other role to play, that we do not need to be proactive. We do, as we see from the Hashmonaim. They didn't sit around and waiting for things to happen. They made things happen. But nevertheless, we always attribute everything to Hashem, because we know that without Hashem's hashgaha, none of these things would have been successful or possible. לקדוש ברוך הוא לעשות ניסים ונפלאות, ולנו להלל ולברכו, שנאמר על עמך וירכתך סלה. If you look at the Rashi on that pasuk, you will see the exact same idea. Wow, the sixth statement. This is still part of what we find in Megillat Ta'anit, Miswath Ner Hanukkah. It talks about the Miswah. This appears in the Talmud Bavli also. What is the Miswah? Ner Echad L'chol Bayit. One candle for the whole household is sufficient. There are those who adopt the practice which is more mehudar, which is to have one candle per member of the household. So if you have two parents, let's say, and three children, that's five. So you have five candles every night. This is already more complicated. Because the Lashon here, the language here, uh, implies that you have, let's say, five the first night, and the next night 10, and the next night 15, etc. Which is what Rambam says. It's a discussion, a machloke between Rambam and the Tosafot, how to understand the miswah of Mahadurim and Mahadurim. And at any rate, Beth Shammai Omerim Yom Rishon Madlik Shimon, and also whether this Beth Shammai and Beth Hillel we're about to read now, is that separate from the Mahadrim and Ahmadrin, or how does it work? So Beth Shammai say on the first day you light 8 candles, Mikal Melach Pohet V'holech. You light one less every night. Beth Hillel, and does that mean for every person, or that means for the whole household? So is it 8 for the whole household, the next night 7 for the whole household? Or if you have 5 people in the household, then the first night you start with 8 times 5, that's 40, and the next, and then go down from there. The other way around, that you add every night. All right, so we won't go into there's another discussion here about the connection, the connection between Pesach, I'm sorry, Hanukkah and Sukkot. Hanukkah and Sukkot. What is the connection? Shnei zikanim hayu b'sidon. Ehad she'asa k'divrei Beth Shammai v'ehad k'divrei Beth Hillel. One of them used to act according to that which we just read in the name of Beth Shammai, the other according to Beth Hillel. Zenothen ta'am lidvaro, uzenothen ta'am lidvaro. And each explains their position. Ze omer kefarei ahav. One of them says, like as we see with the parim, the special korbanot musaf that we bring on Sukkot, called parei ahav, where we begin with 70 and we go down every day. וזה אומר, מעלים בקודש ואין מורידין. Rather, we don't go down, we go up in number. But what the question here, of course, is what is the connection between Parei HaHav of Sukkot and Hanukkah? We'll discuss that as well. And then it goes on to say here that the Miswat Adlakata Mish Tishka Hama min Ashuk. So it tells you when are you to light these candles at the beginning of the evening, which is from sunset onwards. And as long as there are people walking around who will see it, that's the time for lighting the candles. All right, so, and then it speaks about where do you light it? You light it al petach be'tovim b'chutz, the entrance to your home, facing the street. If a person lived in an upper floor, then he can light in his window, and if you're scared for whatever reason, you feel threatened if you were to light this because of the enemies who live in whose midst you live, then you place it inside your home. Okay. So what did we see from all of that? We had the initial statement in Megillat Ta'anit, simply saying there are 8 days of celebration, or 8 days when we do not do sad or mournful things. And then there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 statements expanding on that initial statement. Of those 7 statements, how many mention Nespach Hashem?
Was it one?
Just one. The first one, in this case, the first one, Aleph. But Bet, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Waw, and Zayin mention nothing about Nespach Hashem. Furthermore, if you look at Al Nisim that we recite, على نسيم على الجفروت التشوت الملحموت وبذوف شعصية الأبوثان etc. Go through that whole nusach. Where does it say anything about Nespach Hashem? It does say that they entered the Mikdash with likul nerot b'hasrot kovshecha. That's entirely true. And they did for the reason that we mentioned, because that was the easiest and the initial thing that they could do, the thing that was the most easily doable. But Nespach Hashem is not mentioned at all, except in one of those sources, which is from the Talmud Bavli. Nor is it mentioned in Sefer Hashmonaim, nor is it mentioned by Yosef ben Matityahu. For all of these reasons, I think it can be understood, and I think it's entirely correct to claim that. So it seems to me, at least, that Nes Pach Hashem, which is mentioned only in Talmud Bavli, is I do not believe it is an historical event. I think it's a legend. Legends are good and powerful things, and they have their place and their purpose. But it makes very little sense, and it's very difficult to explain why such a thing would not be mentioned um, in all those other statements that we just read, which are all from all Chazalic statements that were mentioned in Wikidaf Ta'nib. It's impossible to explain why it's not mentioned in Ala Nisim. And if some people have claimed that, well, there must have been such a miracle, because otherwise you would not say Hallel. That's why we say Hallel. That's what the Talmud says. That's why we say Hallel. But that's a misreading of the text of the Talmud, and you don't have to rely on what I'm telling you now. You can look at what the Maharal writes in his book Ner Mitzvah on Hanukkah on page Kaf Beth, and you will find page 22, and you will find that he writes explicitly that there would be absolutely no halachic reason to recite Hallel if the only event being celebrated was the fact that a certain amount of oil lasted longer than expected. He says that the reason was because of the Yeshua and the Nisahon, the victory over our enemies and the salvation, and in war and the general this watershed event which changed Jewish history for all time. By the way, there's no question. Anyone who understands Jewish history knows that without the events of Hanukkah, without this rebellion of the Hashmonaim, there would not be a Jewish people today. Because if the Jews of Eretz Yisrael had been Hellenized and had ceased to act as and live as Jews, the Jews overseas in Chutz La'aretz, in Bavel, in Paras, in other countries, would have that was the center of the Jewish world, even though perhaps it was not the majority of the Jews. Apparently, it was not, but it was the spiritual center of the Jews. And without that spiritual center, the rest would have collapsed. And that means the Jewish people would have ceased to exist as we know them. There would not be any Jews. There would be we would not be here to discuss any of these events. So Hanukkah, the events of Hanukkah, this uprising headed by the Hashmonaim, by Matityahu and his sons, which was an outstanding and incredible success against all odds, was the event which guaranteed the continued existence of Jewish people. And that is what we celebrate during these days of Hanukkah. I, of course, do not have any doubt that Hashem can cause oil to a supernatural event, such as oil lasting longer than expected. All that is fine. If a person says what it says in the Talmud Bavli, so I believe it, that's fine. That's also, I have no problem with that. If you ask me honestly, I will tell you I don't think it happened. I think it was a popular legend that grew up. But if someone doesn't like what I'm saying in this regard, I have no problem with that. You can adopt any position you wish. The fact is that there is no such halakha that tells you recite Hallel for 8 days because um, a certain quantity of oil lasted longer than expected. And the Maharan writes this explicitly, but that is not the reason we say Hallel ala nisim. And it is a fact that in the Nusach of ala nisim there is no mention of such an event, such a Nespach Hashemen, nor is it mentioned, as we said in the historical sources that we have, namely the book of Maccabees and Josephus. So, so it seems to me. But when Jews are removed from their natural habitat and their natural mode of existence, what happens is that they tend to view everything in miraculous and supernatural terms. And then it becomes almost not only second nature, almost first nature to interpret everything in a supernatural, miraculous manner. And that is why the main message of Hanukkah, in the eyes of many people at least, is Nespach Hashem. That's what is left, because to they cannot really relate to all the historical events with which most Jews are not familiar. Unfortunately, they should be, but they're not. This is a tremendous failure of all the various educational systems, whether it's the Israeli government's educational system, whether it's the Haredi educational system, whether it's even the Dati Lumi system. Very, very unsatisfactory in terms of teaching people the true historical events and the nature of these events, and in general, being aware of the history of the Beit Sheni, of the Second Temple period. This is something that we must know, and yet most Jews have no clue about. That's completely unacceptable and very deleterious. It's very harmful to Jews' ability to understand and conceive of our history, even.
Thank you, Rav Bar-Hayim. I want to thank you for this powerful presentation. And as I've mentioned before, your words have been both prescient and prophetic about the state of Am Yisrael today. And would do us all a great good to take these words to heart.
Thank you, Hazak Baruch, for your kind words, and may we learn more about these events and study the sources and be aware of the history and be inspired by them, Bezrat Hashem.
Amen. I look forward to it. Thank you, Rav Bar-Hayim.
Hazak Baruch, Hayu Baruchim, Shalom, V'nitzachon.